Good morning, Thursday, the 10th of September, 2020. Pastor Ron Jetter, Immanuel Lutheran Church, Grandview, Washington. When last we left Joseph, his coat with sleeves made by his father Jacob had been torn, dipped in animal's blood, and presented to his father with the story that Joseph was devoured by wild animals, leaving Jacob to mourn deeply for his favorite son. Joseph, however, was quite alive, having been sold by Midianites to Potiphar, the captain of the Egyptian guard. He is now somewhere in Egypt and probably in jail, but we don't know that yet. So we're anxious to find out what happened to Joseph, because that's how the story moves forward. In our Bible study yesterday, one of the participants remarked that all of this stuff in Genesis, the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then the 12 sons, and Joseph going down to Egypt, exists for one purpose, and that's to set up the book of Exodus, the story of God's people being enslaved and freed. So this is what they called backstory, and backstory is very important. Well, there are details in the backstory that don't seem important, though, but they're there because they will become important centuries later. So somehow somebody much farther down the line, about 600 years later, said, well, wait a minute, wasn't there a story about Judah, one of King David's ancestors? And how one of David's ancestors got born, and wasn't there some controversy over that? We better include that. So instead of going back to Egypt and finding out what happens to Joseph, we have to take a side trip. So now we're back in the land of Canaan. Chapter 38. Doesn't seem to fit until you realize it fits a much, much bigger picture that goes centuries, even millennia, and how this whole narrative is woven together so beautifully. Chapter 38, verse 1. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and settled near a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite woman whose name was Shua, a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He married her and went into her. She conceived and bore a son and named him E-R. Again she conceived and bore a son whom she named Onan. Yet she bore a son, she named him Shelah. She was in Chezib when she bore him. Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Now this detail is important. We don't know how died, but somehow it was by his foolishness and his disobedience against the will of God. And that leaves Judah's daughter-in-law, Tamar, without an heir, without a child. And Tamar's job as the wife of is to carry on name and carry on Judah's lineage, Judah's genetic material, his DNA. So what are you going to do? Well, we hear about this Jewish law that if a man dies, in fact, there was a discussion between Jesus and the Pharisees. A man dies and his brother marries the widow, and then that man dies and the brother marries the widow, and 7 men died. Who does she belong to in the resurrection? And then Jesus says, there is neither marriage nor giving in marriage in the resurrection. Your question is foolish. But it shows that clear down 1600 years later, there is this strong community more. We see it in the book of Ruth. We see it throughout the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, that a man must have an heir. And if he dies, then his widow must somehow find a suitable father to give her children who will then carry the name of the man who died, so that the man and his father, in this case Grandpa Judah, would have a lineage. So Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law. Raise up offspring for your brother." But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled his seed on the ground whenever he went into his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. What he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death also. Wow. Boy, don't disobey God. Not back then. These days, disobedience, might get you a stern look. God's countenance may be frowning upon you, but killing you because you disobeyed, back then this was everything to them, preserving Judah's lineage. Well, it turns out that the third son, whose name is Shelah, is too young. Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up." For he feared that Shelah would die too, like his brothers. So Tamar returned to her father's house. She does not stay in the house of Judah because she's no longer married to one of Judah's sons. And until she provides Judah with an heir, then it's not going to happen. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah's time of mourning was over, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearer, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep," she put off her widow's garments, put on a veil, wrapped herself up, and sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. She saw that Shelah was grown up, yet she had not been given to him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought her to be a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He went over to her at the roadside, said, "Come, let me come into you," for he did not know she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come into me?" He answered, "I will send you a kid from the flock." And she said, "Only if you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and the staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her, went into her, and she conceived by him. She got up and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. When Judah sent the kid by his friend the Adullamite to recover the pledge from the woman, he could not find her. He asked the townspeople, "Where is the temple prostitute who was at Enaim by the wayside?" They said, "No prostitute has been here." Now, these temple prostitutes were common in the religions of the day, and these would follow Israel all the way down to the Greek time, to the time of Jesus, when it was very attractive. When a man was not able to enjoy relations with his wife, he would go to a temple prostitute and pay a fee, basically making an offering to a foreign god. And God found this absolutely abhorrent, and it was forbidden because it just encouraged the worship of non-gods, of other gods. And we find this throughout the entire Hebrew Bible, this constant temptation to have other gods to worship through the temple prostitutes, to go in and give offerings, or to have little amulets or little objects and to worship them and treat them as though they had power over one's destiny. Constant struggle. But back to the story. He returned to Judah and said, "I have not found her. Moreover, the townspeople said, 'No prostitute has been here.' Judah replied, 'Let her keep the things as her own, otherwise she will be laughed at. As you see, I sent the kid and could not find her.' About 3 months later, Judah was told, 'Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the whore. Moreover, she's pregnant as a result of her whoredom.' And Judah said, 'Bring her out and let her be burned.' As she was brought out, because he's assuming that Tamar has not waited for him to give Shelah, that she has gone ahead and found another man. Well, in fact, she had. As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, It was the owner of these who made me pregnant, she said. Take note, please, whose these are, the signet, the cord, and the staff. And Judah realized he had been tricked, that he was the father of this child. She is more right than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah. Judah did not lie with Tamar again. But Tamar is now pregnant with her father-in-law's child. She is widowed, he is widowed. They weren't married, but then again, who knows about these things back then. When the time of her delivery came, there were twins in her womb. One was named Perez, the other named Zerah. Why is this story in there? Well, we know that David came from the lineage of Judah, of the tribe of Judah. But guess whose son? It wasn't from Shelah. It was from one of the sons of Tamar. So Tamar is now in King David's lineage as well. And so this doesn't become important for another 600 years, but they put a whole chapter in Genesis as part of a backstory of something that's way, way later in Israel's history. Genesis is so rich, it's got so much in it. Maybe tomorrow we get back to the story of Joseph. Yes. See you then.